Well, now that we have invited the Spirit into our time of worship, let us call one another to worship. Will you join me responsively? I'll read the not bold parts, you jump in at the bold parts. The Spirit descends like a dove, bringing peace to unite the world in a just and caring community. The Spirit comes like a breath, bringing life to renew the people of God. The Spirit spreads like fire, bringing energy for witnessing to the love of God. Spirit of the living God, come to us and transform our lives by your power. I have a poem for us on this Pentecost Sunday. It's by a woman named Jessica Powers. Let's listen. To live with the Spirit of God is to be a listener. It is to keep the vigil of mystery, earthless and still. One leans to catch the stirring of the Spirit, strange as the wind's will. The soul walks where the wind of the Spirit blows, turns like a wandering weather vane toward love. It may lament like Job or Jeremiah, echo the wounded heart, the mateless dove. It may rejoice in spaciousness of meadow that emulates the freedom of the sky. It always walks in waylessness, unknowing. It has cast down forever from its hand the compass of the whither and the why. To live with the Spirit is to be a lover. It is becoming love and like to her toward whom we strain with metaphors of creatures, fire sweep and water rush and wind's whim. The soul is all activity, all silence. And though it surges Godward towards its goal, it holds, as moving earth holds sleeping noonday, the peace that is the listening of the soul. Well, some of you have heard this story. In March of 2020, as many of you know, my family and I were on a transatlantic cruise heading for a grant-funded sabbatical when the COVID-19 pandemic decided to storm the world. We arrived in Spain at a time of great global fear and confusion when no one knew much about this virus, other than that it was killing people and killing them fast. As soon as we got close enough to land to use our cell phones, we learned from some friends living there that Spain was planning to close its borders that night, the night we were arriving. We heard they were not supposed to let anyone in or out of the country after that. Well, we had no idea at this point the magnitude of this global crisis or that it would mean that we would ultimately have to completely cancel our sabbatical trip. But we did know that with a son who had had significant respiratory and immune system issues since birth, we didn't want to end up in a hospital there in Spain trying to communicate with doctors and nurses in our broken Spanish. So we decided we needed to get to an English-speaking country. We began looking into the UK, except we discovered there were no flights or trains to get there that night. So we went to the airport, rented a car, and we drove just over the border of France that night. The next day we woke up and we were planning to drive to Lyon, and from there catch the high-speed train to Paris and on to London. Now my 3 kids, who were 6, 6, and 2 at the time, they were tired and cranky and bickering and crying in the back seat. My spouse, Julie, had a perforated eardrum, story for another time, so she was in immense pain in the passenger seat, trying to navigate our way through France. But other than all that, everything was largely going to plan. That is until we ran into a very unfortunate language barrier. Some of you already are giggling because you know the story. Do you know what the French word for diesel fuel is? Anyone know what the French word for diesel fuel is? The one that's on the pumps at the gas station? Gasol, exactly. Which unfortunately looks and sounds an awful lot like our word gasoline, the American word for the opposite kind of fuel, right? Well, you can probably guess what happened. Distracted, sleep-deprived, and anxiety-filled, I made a really bad, quick assumption about that false cognate. I accidentally put diesel into the petrol engine of our rental car. Now, thankfully, I realized my mistake before we drove off from the gas station, but that was just the beginning of our language barrier problems. You see, I got on the phone and I called the rental car company. Thankfully, we'd paid for the extra insurance. And they called the French Highway Patrol, who don't really speak a whole lot of English, it turns out. So I'm trying on the phone to explain what happened to them, what this stupid American who speaks no French had done to my rental car. Finally, it was understood, and they told me they were going to send a tow truck. Well, Julie and the kids needed to use the bathroom, so they went into the gas station restrooms. And while they were inside, the tow truck driver showed up. Of course, he spoke no English as well, and I no French. And I have never in my life seen a tow truck driver work so fast. He had that car loaded up on the tow truck within 2 minutes flat. I'm not kidding. And then he started motioning for me to come get into the truck with him. Now, I'm sitting there desperately trying to type into my Google Translator app that my family is still in the gas station. But he's in a hurry. "You in," he says. And then he begins tapping on the rental car contract that's in my hand, holding up his hand like a phone. I was supposed to call the rental car company, I guessed. Excuse me. So flustered, looking frantically around for Julie and the kids, while calling the rental car company, I get into the tow truck cab. And he takes off. The rental car company wants to talk to the driver. He speaks to them for a couple minutes in French. Finally, I get my phone back, and I'm quickly texting my spouse that I'm in a French truck going somewhere, I don't know where. We drove and drove for what felt like a while, probably was only about 15 minutes, into some industrial park-looking place in what felt like the absolute middle of nowhere. Finally, we stopped at this gated compound, and the tow truck driver opened the gate, drove the car into the garage. We get out, and again, he's motioning, this time for me to get all 3 months' worth of our luggage out of the rental car. Not sure what to do with it at first, but then I noticed there's a waiting area, just like there is at a lot of garages there off to the side. So I start pulling all of our luggage into the waiting area. He comes out of the office shaking "no, no, no" at me and points out to the sidewalk just beyond the gate of the compound. So I wheel all of our luggage out to the sidewalk just outside the gate, and I sit down on a pile of it, ready to wait for my cab. Well, just then, the tow truck driver comes driving back out of the compound, pulls out of the gate, comes back, locks the gate behind him, and takes off. So here I am, sitting on my heap of luggage in industrial, middle of nowhere France, without a soul in sight. And I wait, and I wait. It starts to get dark and cold. And I'm texting with my wife. And her text messages are starting to get more desperate, more anxious, as are mine, frankly. The gas station where I left her and the kids is closing soon, it turns out. The attendants have informed them that they can't stay inside the gas station past 9 p.m. And of course, I have all the outerwear in the car. She's trying to figure out how to call a cab and get to a hotel, but we weren't exactly in a major urban center. We were on a highway. Meanwhile, my cab still hasn't arrived. So I call the rental car company again. Turns out they forgot to send it. Another 45 minutes, and finally, one arrives. Although, of course, again, the taxi driver doesn't speak any English, and I, again, no French. He quickly loads all of our luggage up, and again, I'm sitting there on Google Translator trying to desperately type into my phone, "We need to go back to that gas station and get my family." The problem is I don't even remember what the exit name was in French for that gas station. And I don't know as we start driving in the taxi whether we're heading toward my family or away from them. Well, after many attempts to try to communicate, we still were definitely not understanding each other. But this taxi driver is very kind, and he finally calls his English-speaking friend. I quickly explain the situation to her, which is so bizarre that even for someone who speaks English, it's hard to comprehend what's happening. But finally, she gets it, and she's able to tell him that I need to go get my family at this gas station. I cannot even describe to you the relief that washed over me when this taxi driver finally understood what I needed. Well, just as we got off the phone with his translator friend, I see and recognize the exit for the gas station where we broke down. And so with a lot of quick tapping on the shoulder and motioning, I get the driver to pull off just in time onto the exit. And Julie and the kids are there, thankfully, still inside. We pick them up with 10 minutes to spare before the station closes. There were so many wondrous events that Pentecost day when the Spirit swept through that early band of Jesus followers. But the one that I find most intriguing is that all of these people, speaking in their native tongue, were able to understand each other and be understood by each other and even speak in each other's tongues, even though they didn't know them. Any of you who've ever spent much time in a place where you didn't speak the language, you know what a gift it is when you finally find someone who can understand you and whom you can understand, especially if you happen to find yourself in a situation like I did. And the truth is, even if you speak a second language and so you technically understand the people around you, when you hear someone speaking your native tongue, the one that you were born into, the one that you were raised in, it's like coming home, isn't it? Suddenly there are no filters, no mental gymnastics of trying to translate. It's just easy. You hear those sounds of your mother tongue and it goes straight to your heart. That's your heart language. That's the testimony that the book of Acts gives for what it's like when the Holy Spirit sweeps through a community. It describes this beautiful scene where there is this mystical, awe-inducing, fear-inducing storm of fire and wind, but how somehow the people there are able to speak in each other's languages and hear each other as if they are speaking their own heart language. And suddenly the storm feels beautiful. Encountering the Spirit is that warm feeling of home. It's being seen and heard and understood so fully that even if there is that storm of fire and wind whipping around us, we aren't afraid because we know we're not alone. When the winds of the Spirit move through a community, divisions crumble, the distance closes, and we find beauty even in our wonderful God-given diversity. This summer and fall, I fear, are going to maybe get a little ugly in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election. Already, I imagine you have plenty of neighbors and family members, friends, who seem like they're speaking a completely foreign language. Any of you have that experience? Have people who you cannot for the life of you understand and who cannot seem to remotely even come close to understanding you? Yeah. We have in many ways become alien to each other as we look across the aisle these days, haven't we? We cannot even really agree on what is fact, right? There's a story in the book of Genesis about early humans working harmoniously together and building a tower that would reach all the way to the heavens, the Tower of Babel. And it's looking like they're going to succeed, that in fact there's nothing that they can't tackle together. That is until God comes along and confuses their languages, scatters them over the earth. Now, no longer able to understand each other, they start to divide, fight. They can no longer build anything together, much less a future. Sometimes I wonder if our politicians have read that story of Babel, because they seem to understand really well that if they confuse our conversations and our communication with each other, if they can make us feel that we no longer understand each other, that we aren't speaking the same language, then we won't be able to unite against them or build much of anything. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, that some of us read several years ago now, she writes about the Nixon era and how Nixon and his campaign team, they realized that if poor Southern white people and poor Southern Black people united around their common causes and needs, which were actually quite similar, their platform wouldn't stand a chance. That coalition of poor people united across racial lines would have been almost unstoppable. So they devised a scheme. They were going to use racist messaging of white privilege and racial segregation to make poor white people feel superior to their poor Black counterparts. Make them feel that their well-being depended on keeping that upper hand, that privilege over their Black neighbors, on them being able to say, due to their whiteness, well, at least I'm better off than that guy. They knew that if they could do that, if they could confuse the conversation and the feeling of common cause between poor white people and poor Black people, if they could create animosity and prejudice, then they could get poor white people to vote against Black people's interests rather than for their own interests. It was a divide and conquer plan, and frankly, it worked. They've now uncovered documents showing very plainly and unapologetically that this was, in fact, a verifiable strategy of the Nixon campaign. It was called the Southern Strategy. I don't know what all the political strategies at foot today are. I'm sure the history books will probably be able to capture it much better and much more clearly than we can right now in the midst of it. But I do know that the campaigns and the elections of late have served to divide and confuse and distance us from our neighbors. They have filled us with anxiety. They have left us fearful. They have so othered our neighbors, that our neighbors now feel like enemies. And it's left some of us feeling very similar to that post-Babel despair, that we as a human family are no longer capable of building a future together, building anything that would resemble heaven, and that instead we are simply doomed to keep moving toward hell on earth. But today I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to have the Spirit sweep through our communities the way it did that first Pentecost day, healing those divisions, healing that confusion of Babel. I want you to imagine being able to speak to each other again, heart to heart, heart language to heart language, with that deep balm of understanding. Speak to each other such that it becomes possible once more for us to build beloved community together, build that heaven on earth. That is, I believe, what Jesus came to bring into our world, a healing for that Babel story, a mending of the confusion of our communication with each other, and a God aid who could help us. Help us not to build another tower of Babel trying to reach toward heaven, but help us build heaven right here, right now, with each other. The testimony of the book of Acts is that even though that great show of fire and wind and those raging dialects, even though all of that swept through on that one day, everyone henceforward who follows the way of love Jesus taught, we continue to have access to that very same Spirit. She lives inside each of us, empowering us to understand each other, to speak and to hear the heart of others, to build beloved community, just as the Spirit empowered those early communities of Jesus followers on that first Pentecost day. Can you imagine the healing that would be possible if we lived from that Spirit inside of us, instead of our own fears and anxieties, our own anger and judgment? What would it be like if we truly trusted her to guide us bravely and boldly into the love that Jesus taught us, even into a love for our enemies? I wonder if we might find that our children start prophesying, and our young start seeing visions, and our old start dreaming dreams once again. I wonder if we all might be saved. May it be so. May the fire of Pentecost light us up and connect us heart to heart with each other once more. Amen.